I think the reason I stuck so rigidly to the handbook that summer was because if I didn't, the damp would have gotten into my head. And out at the high-altitude station on the ridge of Mount Ho, once you let the rain get inside your logic, you start looking at the tree line like it's a row of teeth. I was 24, desperate to prove I wasn't just another seasonal hire who'd wash out before the August melt. So when I found that second mailbox, my first instinct wasn't to report it, but to figure out which regulation it violated so I could rip it down myself. It was bolted to the dry cedar siding on the back of the tool shed, right behind the firewood stack, where the overhang barely kept the northwest squalls from turning everything to mush, a standard heavy-gauge rural mailbox, but rusted down to a flaky, bruised orange that came off on your palms like dried blood. It shouldn't have been there because the United States Forest Service does not drop official mail 3 miles past a motorized trailhead, let alone on the blind side of a tracking cabin. And our actual service drop was a locking aluminum locker on the porch facing the gravel turnaround. I remember standing there in the downpour, my boots sinking into the rotting pine needles, thinking some grandfathered property owner or an off-grid squatter from the Ho River Valley was playing a passive-aggressive territorial game with the agency. Because when I popped the latch, the hinge didn't squeak. It had been greased recently, the slick black lithium smell cutting right through the wet cedar. Inside lay a standard yellow-lined legal pad page, folded into 3 clean sections, written in the flat, black ball white script of someone who spent 30 years filling out timber sales receipts. It just said, 0700, rain. Barometer holding at 29.2. Check the southern drainage culvert for beaver blockages, clearing brush along the boundary wire near milestone 42. I didn't think much of it that first afternoon, assuming it was a joke left by Miller, the senior district ranger who dropped me off with 3 weeks of canned chili and a radio that only hit the valley if you stood on top of the propane tank. So I tucked the paper into my slicker pocket, cleared my log for the day according to Section 4 of the regional manual, and went to bed listening to the water hammering the tin roof like gravel thrown against a window. But the next evening, after tracking 6 miles of washed-out switchbacks, I went behind the shed to grab 2 splits of hemlock for the stove, and the little metal flag on the rusted box was pointing up. My heart didn't drop or anything cinematic like that. I just felt that specific, irritating prickle of professional anxiety, where you realize a stranger has been walking through your workspace while you were gone. The second note was exactly the same handwriting. The ink dried despite the 90% humidity. 0700. Overcast. Fog down to the ferns. Swapped a battery on the weather station Noop. Noticed some heel drag tracks near the old homestead orchard. Probably a black bear. Didn't pursue. I kept those pages in my desk drawer under the carbon copy trip tickets, meaning to bring them up during the Tuesday radio check. But when Miller finally crackled through the static on Tuesday night, his voice sounding small and metallic against the storm, I found myself lying to him. He asked if I was keeping up with the structural maintenance logs for the cabin, and I looked down at the handwritten pages spread out beside my kerosene lamp, comparing them to the official historical logs bound in the green canvas binder on my shelf. The handwriting in the binder from 2018, the year a ranger named David Vance supposedly walked out on his contract, left his keys on the stove, and took a retail job in Buston, matched the notes exactly. Every loop on the capital O, every rigid, straight-backed 7. I didn't tell Miller because if Vance was living in the brush 3 miles from my bed, poaching, or just having some kind of prolonged break from reality, telling the district meant 3 supervisors showing up with state troopers, turning my quiet station into a crime scene, and effectively ending my chances at a permanent slot next season. I convinced myself it was a harmless, sad routine, and old-timer who couldn't let go of the hills, hiking up from the bottoms to leave his ghost work in a box I wasn't even supposed to know about. I even started checking it at exactly 5 p.m. every evening, right after my shift concluded, under the terms of my employment agreement, treating it like a shift change with a man who wasn't there. Then came the Friday after the big wind shift, when the rain finally stopped and the forest got that deep, heavy silence where you can hear the water dripping from a canopy 300 feet above, like a thousand's clocks ticking out of sync. The note that afternoon was short: 0700. Clear. Boundary check. Discovered the Eastern Surveyor Monument from 46 is off by 24 inches. The fence line was set wrong during the Truman administration. The cabin isn't in the park. That bit of trivia bothered me enough that I actually pulled out the faded plat map from the station's fire locker, the old linen-backed master survey from 1952. It took me 2 hours with a brass protractor and a flashlight to calculate the section lines, my fingers tracing the tiny ink dots through the creases until my eyes burned. Vance was right. The official park boundary, the legal line where federal jurisdiction ended and the trackless, unmanaged timber company land began, didn't run along the creek like everyone thought. It cut diagonally right through the gravel flat behind the cabin. The tool shed, and specifically the cedar wall where that rusted mailbox was bolted, sat exactly 24 inches outside the United States National Park System. It was a stupid, meaningless bureaucratic error, the kind of thing that only matters to guys who write land titles, but it made my stomach feel cold and empty in a way I couldn't justify by looking at the rules. I went out back with a headlamp, the beam cutting through the white mist rising from the wet dirt, and I opened the box again, hoping it was empty so I could just go to sleep and forget the map. There was another sheet. The ballpoint ink looked fresh enough to smear, the paper still warm from being carried inside someone's wool shirt pocket against their ribs. 1830. Stationary, standing by the woodpile. The new kid is looking at the map through the kitchen window. He's got the lamp too high. The wick is smoking. I didn't drop the paper, and I didn't scream, because the handbook says that in encounters with unauthorized persons in backcountry sectors, you maintain a flat, authoritative demeanor to discourage escalation. I just stood there in the dark, my hand resting on the cold, greasy latch of that second mailbox, listening to the vast, wet weight of the woods behind the shed. Realizing that whoever was writing those logs wasn't hiding in the brush or coming up from the valley at night. They were just keeping the schedule. They had been keeping it for 8 years, 5 feet from where I cooked my bacon, completely outside the park, and the only reason I hadn't seen them was because my eyes were only trained to look at things that fell under my jurisdiction. I walked back inside very slowly, locked the heavy fire door, and turned down the kerosene wick until the room went gray, but I didn't pack my bags, and I didn't call the valley. If I leave before my contract is up, the paperwork goes into my permanent personnel file, and once that happens, you can't ever get back in. So I'm still here, and I still do my rounds by the book every morning at 7, but I don't look out the back window anymore. And when I check that rusted box at 5 o'clock to see what the previous shift encountered, I make sure to leave my own log tucked inside, just so the records stay clean.